Hello again. As it's Easter, I decided to talk about one of my favourite pieces of Bach. I've talked about this last Easter. I think I talked about the St. John Passion. Bach wrote, apparently he wrote possibly 4 or 5 passion settings, but they were all lost except for the 2, the St. John Passion and the St. Matthew Passion. And both of them are very, very powerful works. I always listen to them at Easter time because I find that they express the whole kind of Easter story in a very, very moving way. Now, whether you are religious or not, whether you're a Christian or not, I don't see how really any sensitive person couldn't be moved by the story of Easter, because it is one of the most powerful stories of human suffering and also of the idea of redemption. It's part of the whole kind of Christian story, which is a vision of how possibly the transience and the suffering of life can be overcome, and there can be some hope of a new life in the future. Now, whether you actually believe in that literally or not, whether you think it's symbolic, whatever you think about it, to my mind at any rate, the story of Easter and the story of Jesus is very, very moving and powerful. And of course it's central to so much of of European culture and civilization. And at the time of Bach, in the context of Lutheran Germany, this was the most profound expression of something very, very important to everybody. And when these passions were performed, of course, that's what's interesting, they weren't done as concerts. Usually, almost always today, they're done as basically in a concert, not even necessarily in a church. In Bach's time, they would have been done as part of a service, probably on Good Friday, I think it was, and there would have been a sermon in the middle, between the 2 halves, perhaps, of the Passion, and the congregation would also have joined in. The thing about these Passions is that they're interspersed with chorales, the Lutheran chorales, which were basically hymns, which most people would have known, and they would have the congregation would have joined in. So it was much more of a kind of participatory community event, and presumably it would have been quite an intense experience. So the two Passions, St. John and St. Matthew, they're both wonderful. St. Matthew is bigger and longer, and unfortunately doesn't get performed very often. It doesn't get performed anywhere near as often as the St. John Passion, which is obviously a lot easier to do because it's shorter and on a smaller scale. The Matthew Passion uses very big resources. It uses a double choir and a double orchestra, and also ideally 2 organs. So obviously, it needs a lot more people and money to put on. And it's quite a while since I've been to a live performance at the St. Matthew, whereas I've been to the St. John Passion almost every year. I haven't actually been this year for years. So it's a wonderful setting, and it was composed originally about 1725, I believe, and then Bach revised it several times. It was obviously important to him during his career. There's some argument about how it was performed. Nowadays it's normally done with a large choir and quite a large orchestra, or double orchestra and so on. In those days it would have been smaller resources, and some people think that it was actually done more like a kind of solo piece with just one voice per part. Personally, I think that's rather unlikely, but it probably would have been smaller scale than we hear nowadays. It consists of there's an opening and closing chorus, very, very powerful, large-scale chorus, which set this solemn tone. And then there's a narration of the story of the Passion, of Christ's Passion. And the characters are... there's a narration by a person called the evangelist, a tenor, and then the various characters, Christ himself, Peter, Mary, etc., are sung by soloists. It's particularly moving in the Matthew Passion. When Christ sings, his voice is surrounded by a kind of what some people describe as a kind of halo strings, which gives it this very moving, very kind of ethereal quality. I have actually myself composed the setting of the Passion. My Passion is called a Gnostic Passion because it's influenced by the scriptures of the Gnostics, who are a kind of, well, most people consider a heretical Christian group, or a collection of groups. And in that setting, it's very influenced by Bach. I can't help it because the influence is so enormous. I've done the same thing. I've used the strings to create a kind of halo, a special kind of halo around the voice of Christ. And if anybody's interested in my Gnostic Passion, by the way, if you just search online for a Gnostic Passion by Lawrence Hughes, you will find it on a site called Score Exchange, which where there's a score that you can kind of play through, and you can look at the words and so on and get an idea of the piece. It hasn't been performed for real yet. I live in hope. Anyway, so but today oh yeah, I was going to mention that. So you get the story, and then interspersing the story, you have solo arias and choruses, which are poetic texts, which are contemplations on the meaning and significance of the story. And some of these are absolutely supreme. They're some of the greatest music that Bach ever wrote. I think St. Matthew Passion, maybe the Mass in B minor, contains some of the greatest music he ever wrote. And I want to today just introduce a performance by the great Dame Janet Baker. Dame Janet Baker, she's retired now, but she is and was my favourite woman singer of the 20th century. She was a contralto, she was a mezzo-soprano, and then later I think she became a contralto. I'm not quite sure about that. Anyway, she has this very special voice and way of singing, which I think is quite unique. I heard her live on many occasions, saw her sing in concerts and in opera and so on, and it was a wonderful voice. Obviously she was retired now, but there are many recordings. And I think she sings this particular aria. This aria is called Erbarme Dich, forgive me, Lord. And it's sung immediately after the account of Peter's denial of Christ, which is obviously one of the most poignant moments of the whole story. Peter has said to Jesus earlier, you know, whatever happens, I will always follow you, and I will never betray you, and I will be with you to the end. And then Jesus looks at him and says, actually, he says, before the cockerel has crowed 3 times, you will betray me. And this is what happens. When Jesus is taken off by the soldiers and so on, Peter panics, and he follows them at a distance to see what's happened. And 3 times people say to him, you were a follower of that Jesus, weren't you? You were one of his men. And 3 times he says, no, I wasn't. I don't know the man. And then he hears a cockerel crow, and he remembers the words of Jesus. And it's a terrible moment. It's a real amazing depiction of the frailty of human nature, really. Whatever his promises, whatever he believed, when it actually came to the point, he failed. And this, after all, is Peter. Remember, who Peter is regarded as the founder of the Christian church. And so after the account of that, this aria is sung, and Janet Baker sings it beautifully here. Now, she sings it in a recording which is in quite a romantic style. Normally Bach nowadays is done in what's called an authentic style with Baroque style instruments, and it's not done with, it's done in a much less sort of expressive romantic way than used to be the case. This recording with Janet Baker is somewhat in romantic tradition, and there's a solo violin. That's the thing that Bach often does. He has a solo instrument that kind of weaves around the voice, and in this work it particularly does that. The violin has this absolutely amazing, incredibly poignant, bittersweet melody that starts off the aria, and then the singer sings, and then the violin weaves around the singer, and the effect is incredible. But the violin playing in this piece is quite romantic, and the sound of the orchestra. But I don't think it matters. I mean, I like authentic performances, but I think in this case the artistry, particularly of Janet Baker, is so great that it doesn't matter that it's not quite in what people would nowadays regard as an authentic Baroque style. And after all, actually, people don't really know what Baroque music sounded like. We can only guess, so there are various theories. Anyway, so the aria is the aria that comes after Peter's denial of Christ, and I think it just sums up the feeling of Easter, certainly of Good Friday, and then of course on Easter Day there is the story of the resurrection and hope and new birth, but for Good Friday this sums up this feeling that mankind is innately flawed and is asking to be forgiven for not having lived up to what Jesus expected of us. And as I say, if you may or may not believe in any of this literally, you may have complete contempt for organised religion, you may be a person of great faith, you may be somewhere in between, which is probably what I would say of myself, but I don't think anybody could not be moved by this aria and by the story that it illustrates. So I'll just read you the text, and then I'm going to put a link to Janet Baker singing it in the notes underneath this video. So here we are, Erbarme Dich, sung by Janet Baker, and this is the text. Erbarme dich, mein Gott, meine Seelen willen. Schaue hier, Herz und Auge weint vor dir bitterlich. Erbarme dich, mein Gott. Have mercy, my God, for the sake of my tears. See here before you, heart and eyes weep bitterly. Have mercy, my God.